In today's SharePoint video, we are going to talk about version history, which is probably one of the most useful aspects of SharePoint. It will save your butt. It has saved mine so many times. It's a fundamental aspect of SharePoint, and it really is one of the best reasons to jump onto the SharePoint bandwagon because it's going to give you some functionality that you probably don't have elsewhere. I frankly will say it is reason enough to use SharePoint and nothing else when it comes to sharing, storing, and accessing files. Essentially, it protects the process that you go through when you develop, create, review, and publish documents, files, multimedia, whatever you want to go through. And it's also available to anybody that uses SharePoint. It is a bedrock tool within SharePoint, so it's been around since 2007 at least. It's available in 2010, 2013, SharePoint Online, and of course SharePoint 2016. But what are we talking about here? Basically, every time you save, upload, or check in a file in SharePoint, a new version is created. You see a little screenshot on the right here of a file that I have in SharePoint that has 8 versions. It keeps track of each of those versions each time that I saved that file, or I uploaded a new version over top of it, or I checked the file out, made some changes, and then checked it back in. It creates a new version of the file. Tells you when the file changes were made, tells you who made those changes, and gives you some idea of the size of the file after all of those changes. It allows for edit summaries under the comments section, and it also keeps track of changes to metadata. So you can see in version 4 here, the title of my file was changed from nothing to Proposed Budget for Management Review FY 2016. It works with any SharePoint-friendly file type, not just Office files. So this is a huge win because a lot of things that happen in SharePoint are really just made for Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and OneNote, and even some of those functions don't do everything that they should in all of those file types. But this is actually going to work for every single file type that SharePoint will accept. So if you want to talk about a JPEG or an MP4 or an audio file or anything that you can drag and drop or upload into a SharePoint document library, you got version history behind you. So one of the fundamental things about version history is it gives you configuration control over your files. Do your shared drives do this? I will bet my next paycheck that they do not. Or if they do, you may not even know how they do it. So if your organization is currently using shared drives as the place to keep most of your files, I'm sure it does a backup, but I'll bet 1, if you're not in IT, you probably don't know how often that occurs. And 2, if you do know how to restore an old file that you screwed up or want to get the older version of it, you probably have to go through IT. With SharePoint, you don't have to go through IT, you can do it yourself, and it happens whenever you save a file. It's not on some sort of arbitrary time basis. So if your shared drives currently back up every hour on the hour and you happen to do a ton of work between 12:03 and 12:57, and then you lose that file, you can only back up to 12 o'clock. And you just lost that full 50 plus minutes worth of work, and there's no way of recovering it. Whereas in SharePoint, if you had saved that file a couple times, you would be able to go back to the last time that you saved it, which is on you. You have control over that process. You're not dependent upon an automated system that may not be the most robust setup that you could think of. It keeps a running history of changes to your file so you can see who's made what changes through the process of creating, reviewing, and publishing your files. And you know who made those changes and when, so you can hold people accountable if they've gone through and made changes that aren't necessarily the best, because that happens to all of us. You can also compare versions. So if you wanted to bring up 2 versions of a Word file and track changes hadn't been turned on, you can just bring them both up next to each other and take a look. You can do the same thing with any type of file. If you wanted to look at 2 versions of an image that you have saved in SharePoint, you can look at the 2 next to each other and try to figure out what those changes are, like in an old copy of a Highlights magazine. And it's just a big win because you're not worried about what you're looking at or where your files are. They're always going to be there and available for you. You can also correct errors. This is a huge deal. Everybody encounters a corrupt file once in a while in SharePoint. I wish it didn't happen as often as it does. It happens all the time to people all over the place. You're not any more likely to be hit by a corrupt file than anybody else, but whenever it happens to me, I always think, what the heck? Why does this have to happen to me right now? It's always at a very important part of the work that I'm doing. But if I end up with a corrupt file, I can always just delete that corrupted file and go back to the previous version, and I no longer have to worry about it. Whereas if I kept the file at the corrupted state, I probably couldn't open it any longer. So it's a nice way for me to recover from it myself. I don't have to get IT involved. If I was using a shared drive, I'd be stuck going back to whatever time they did the last backup, which could have been midnight the night before. So if I'm at the end of the day and I've worked on this thing all day long, I may not actually have anything to go back to, which could be horrible. It also allows for you to delete a mistake and overwrite. So let's say that you made the mistake of uploading a PowerPoint presentation with the file name presentation1.pptx, which is a bad practice, I might add, and somebody else decides to upload a file with the same name within that same document library, you're both working on two totally different things, the second person who uploads that file will end up overwriting your file. Now, they'll get a little warning saying, hey, there's another file with this name, but if they ignore that and they just keep going and just click yes because that's what people do, they're going to overwrite your file. Thanks to SharePoint versions, you can restore the last version over the version that they overwrote. So that means that you don't lose your file. It also means that you have to reach out to that person and say, hey, buddy, let's not do this again. And they should say in return, hey, let's not, name files the default that Microsoft gives us. So it's a good lesson learned from both sides. But it is a great way to recover from that problem. It also, and this is going to happen to everybody sometimes, you get a particularly bad review of a file. You send a document out for peer review, it comes back, it is just all red. You don't even know where to start with it. You don't think that 90+% of the review comments or changes are even warranted, and you just want to say, you know what, I give up, I'm just changing, I'm not even going to change anything in here, I think this is bad, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. Clearly you're making a professional decision here, so I'm not giving you advice on how to deal with your colleagues, but the point is, if you want to get rid of all of those changes, you can just revert back to the previous version, and it never happened as far as SharePoint's concerned. So it gives you a real good out in that respect, and it brings you back to that clean version, and you don't have to worry about it. Now I'm going to do a quick demonstration of version history and show you how you can use it starting in the next few minutes. Okay, I'm in a document library in my demonstration site, and I'm going to go through some basics of version history. The first is how to access the version history of a file. It actually depends on which version of SharePoint that you're in. So if you're in Office 365, which is SharePoint Online, there's a nice quick way to get there if you want to right-click. Microsoft has taken over the right-click menu when you're in SharePoint in Office 365, and this is also in SharePoint 2016. Gives you really quick access to a number of things that you can change in here, which is actually a great upgrade, except for the fact that you do lose the real right-click functionality that exists in other browsers that you're used to. Maybe you wanted to get a link and copy a link to something. You can't do that any longer because Microsoft has sort of hijacked that menu, but in the good sense, you now have very quick access to things like version history. So you can click version history here, it'll bring you to the version history pane. You can also click the checkbox next to your file name and go up to the ribbon. When in doubt, always go to the ribbon, and I can click version history up here. That will also bring me to the version history pane, or I can click the ellipsis, brings up my preview pane right here, and then I can click the extra ellipsis, and click the version history button right here. My favorite, I think, is pretty obvious because I went with it first, is that right click option because I hate having to do multiple clicks if I don't have to. So one right click and it brings up my version history. Brings up a pane, shows you the 8 versions that I have here, and it tells you that I made versions on these dates and times. They were modified by me. The size of the file changed a little bit in that time frame, and it also offers this column for comments. Now, if you use check-in and check-out in your document libraries, it actually asks you when you go for the check-in if you want to provide comments. The comments section is essentially an edit summary of what you did. Can be very helpful. I personally do not use checkout, check-in very often. In fact, I dislike it a lot. Therefore, I don't get the opportunity to provide comments if I don't go through that process. So you see that I don't have any comments here. The version history also keeps track of any metadata changes. So in this library, I have not added any custom metadata. So there's no fields that I have to put in there that I've put in myself. But things like the title of the file, which is a default piece of metadata that comes with a document library, is available. I did add a title. So I have a more descriptive title or name for the file, and I'm not just going by the short file name, which gives me better search optimization within SharePoint. It's easier to find, and it's just also more descriptive for anybody that's trying to look for it. So you see in version 4, I did change the file title. Now, from this pane, what do I get to do? Well, I can order these things based on the size of the file, based on any of these column titles. So if I want to order it in alphabetical order by who made changes, right now I'm the only one that has made changes, but I could put this in alphabetical order and see all changes made by a certain person. I can also order this based on the version number and when the thing was modified, which would be similar. But that's actually pretty handy. So if I know there was some major change at one point where the file went from a huge size to a small size, it looks like somebody cut out a lot of content. That could be a bad sign. I can look at that. Or in the reverse, when I know I spent a number of hours working on the thing and I went from it being a 2-page document to a 32-page document, that file size is going to change very substantially, and I can see that very easily. Now, if I want to play with the past versions of this file, what do I do? Essentially, you hover over any of the versions. Each one of them is linked here. I can access any version that I want. So if I want to view this 6th version, I can hover over that and I can click the name. And what it's going to do is it's going to save that file locally for me, so I can open that up in the application that opens that file type up, and I can look at it. I can open up version 5, I can save version 4 and open it up. I can do all of that at the same time. I can compare them and see what the differences are. I can also go through and click the downward facing triangle here and get a menu. I have 3 options. I can view the file, which is not an intuitive operation. You may think it will open the file up. It will not. It actually opens up the metadata of the file. So it'll show you the title, the file name, file size, most recent edits, that kind of thing. I can restore the file, which means that I am going to bring this version, so in this case version 7, click OK, and it's now going to replace version 8 and create version 9 from version 7. Version 8 still exists, so it's there, no big deal, but version 9 is going to be identical to version 7. So that's handy. The other options I have here is I can delete an old version. In older versions of SharePoint, especially SharePoint 2007 and I think 2010, but I'm not positive, every time you made a version, it actually created an entirely new copy of that file. So if it was a, let's say, 50 megabyte PowerPoint presentation, the minute you made a version of it, you just made another 50 megabyte presentation file. So that's 100 megabytes. So if you're worried about file space, you could run into that problem very quickly. With SharePoint 2013 and moving onwards, it is now a delta that is saved. So it starts with the first version and then adds to the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, as opposed to creating a new version each time. So you're no longer really concerned about the space allocation, which is a great thing. But if you ever want to delete something, or there's a version of a file that's old and you're worried that somebody might open it up and get data that is really outdated and they just should not have access to it, go ahead and delete it and it will pull it out from the version history. So let's say I want to delete version 5. What SharePoint will do, it's going to make sure that I want to do that. Click OK. It gets rid of version 5. The numbering system doesn't change. It just means that version 5 is gone. So version 4 now jumps straight to version 6. I can also delete all versions if I want to. Not going to do that, no real reason to, but it'll keep the current version and delete all the past versions. Now let's say I want to get version 5 back. That was a whoopsie, I shouldn't have done that. My handy dandy recycle bin, I can jump to that real quick and you can see all the files that I have deleted from my site. And here is that file. It's the 2016 budget spreadsheet, and in parentheses is the version number. So I can click the checkbox next to it, and I can click Restore Selection, and the browser wants to make sure that I'm cool with that. I am. Click OK, and it now refreshes this page. I am still in the recycle bin, and it is no longer in the recycle bin. So if I jump back to my site, and I hop back into that document library and I look at that file and I right click and I open up the version history, there's version 5. And it's not restored at today's date. It's restored back to the date that it had originally been created. So it's as if nothing has changed. As with anything SharePoint, there are some subtleties that you should definitely be aware of, if not be wary of. The first is that, oddly, when you create a new document library in SharePoint, or when your site owner creates a library for you to use, version history is not turned on by default. I have no idea why, and this is very dangerous because if you go jump into a new document library, or the site owner created it and just never remembered to turn version history on, and you start using it like version history is turned on because, I mean, why wouldn't it be, right? Yeah, you can find yourself really unhappy because you're playing in the sandbox like the rules are what you think they are, but it turns out they are not. So you could find yourself doing a ton of work and then you maybe overwrite a file by mistake and you're like, no big deal, I can go back and I can restore that old version, but that old version doesn't exist because version control wasn't turned on to begin with. So if you jump between libraries on a regular basis, you need to make sure that you stay in contact with the site owner, because the site owners, multiple maybe in this case, need to remember to turn version history on, and they're all going to be at different levels of training or fluency in SharePoint, so some may not even know that they forgot or that they had to do it in the first place. So just you do have to take some responsibility here, because you could find yourself in a position that is not fun by any means. The next thing is there's a limit to the number of versions that you can save in SharePoint. It is a different number depending on which version of SharePoint, and it also depends on your IT admins. They may have set a reasonably low number to keep space allocation reasonable, so you're not taking up a ton of space that you don't need to be taking up for the luxury of versions. If you're in SharePoint Online, Microsoft actually sets it at 500, which is a very large number. So if you do that, I'd be pretty impressed. The actual recommended limit by Microsoft is 400,000. If you find yourself creating 400,000 copies of a file or versions of a file, more power to you. That is for major versions. If you are familiar with minor versions, which I will get into in another video in the future, it's actually 511. I don't know why that number, oh yes I do, 512 is a binary number, so it must have to do with that. It always does, and I'm never sure why, but that's what it is. 512 minus 1, starting at version 0. So the limit to the number of versions can also be lowered by your site owner. So if they have a reason to lower it to 10 instead of the default of, let's say your company's default is 100 and they want to lower it to 10, maybe they have a good reason for that, but you need to be aware of that, because it's not like SharePoint's going to say, by the way, you just hit the max number of versions, so all of the old ones are going to go away. So if your version limit is 10, when you get to version 11, version 1 goes away. When you get to 12, version 2 goes away, and you've lost those. So you need to be aware of what they are. And when co-authoring, which is a topic unto itself, I will get into it in a future video, versions are made every 30 minutes after editing begins. Now this is important because when you're co-authoring, co-authoring is a concept where you and somebody else, or maybe somebody's else, have the same file open, you're all working on them at the same time, and most likely you're probably working in Office Online or Office Web Apps, the browser version of Word or Excel or PowerPoint. That doesn't have a save button, you'll notice, because everything that you do in there is automatically saved to the server, and that's a new kind of paradigm for people. They feel really weird about not being able to press a save button, and I'm just as guilty in that respect and still kind of getting over that feeling. So you might think that that means that SharePoint's making an infinite number of versions. Every time a new character is added or deleted, a version is changed. Well, that's not actually the case, because that would be completely unrealistic. But what does happen is it does it on a timed basis. So in Office 365, it does it every 30 minutes, and you can't change that. IT can't change that. Nobody can change that. That's just the way it is. On the local on-premises version for SharePoint 2013, and I think co-authoring is also supported by SharePoint 2010 if you're using Office Web Apps or Office Online, the IT people that own the system can lower that to happen every 5 minutes if they wanted to. So if that's something that you would like your IT department to consider changing because you think it would be better, reach out to them and let them know. But just know that the versions are made automatically for you. If you want to make a version and you don't want to wait that half hour, you can always force a check-in. So make all your changes. You know that you've only edited for 5 minutes, but you made a big number of changes and you don't want to wait for that 30-minute mark. You can close the file, and don't worry, your changes have been saved. They're just not a, quote, new version. You can go into the document library, check that file out, and literally make no changes, check it back in, and it's going to ask you if you want to make any comments, that kind of thing. And when you made the check-in, you now have created a new version, so you can kind of get around the time limit. You can actually take advantage of major and minor versions, and you can use them as part of a much more formal release system, almost like software. So minor versions are essentially seen as drafts that can have limited exposure based on permissions. You can also throw content approval on it so that you don't get a major version that's available for view by anybody with access to the site or viewer access to the site until the content has been approved by upper management. It also takes into account the permissions of the file, so it's actually very powerful, and I'll get into that in a separate video. There's a huge list of opportunities here that version history can support. This was just a basic overview, and it's something that now you will probably want to use in your everyday life, but we can get into formal and more policy-driven work processes that incorporate version history as part of it that can really make your configuration control the envy of the rest of your organization, because people will see that you guys have your stuff together and that you really do. So that is essentially the overview of version history, the basics in SharePoint. And I am expecting that you will probably see some benefit from this. So if you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Please share it with your colleagues, with your IT group, with any other people that will pay attention to you. And be sure to follow us on social media and visit icansharepoint.com for some more great, useful, realistic, real-world, practical SharePoint examples and how-tos that you can use to make your life a little bit better at work.